Today, we are joined by Ragan. Ragan, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you study.
Well, hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Dr. Ragan Glover. I am an assistant professor here at University of Texas at San Antonio, and I study mobile and immersive media. And what I'm really interested in my research is how can these types of media, that is, these ways of relating through technology, actually shape our relationship to each other? How does it change the way that we interact in the world? And what are our experiences using these kind of media like? And so I'm often interested in what we call user experience research, studying how users are actually using these technologies in their everyday life to form relationships, to find information while they're on the go, and really just to have a sense of connection with the world around them.
There's a lot going on with the evolution of mobile and how it's impacting your relationships. What's some of the most interesting things that you found in your research?
One of the things that I have studied are things like mobile games. And a lot of the times when we think of mobile games, we're like, oh, these are really frivolous types of things that we do. They're just leisurely activities. But something that I'm really interested in is how mobile games can actually help us to connect to the world around us and to our surroundings. So a couple of years ago, back in 2000 through 20, I did a study with Adriana de Souza y Silva and a couple other colleagues where we studied how the game Pokemon Go actually helped players to feel a sense of connection to their community. And so one of the things that we found was that in Nairobi and Rio de Janeiro, people were playing these games, but they were actually seeing the conditions of the cities that they lived in and then coordinating with one another to actually go out into their communities, go out into their cities and fix social issues. Along with that, they were acting in these careful ways towards each other. When I say careful, I don't mean cautious. I mean enacting care towards one another, such that, if someone didn't have data for their phone for a week, they would provide Wi-Fi hotspots to one another. Or, if someone didn't feel safe playing the game, they would coordinate meetups with each other so they could, move through the city in a way that made them feel safe and secure while still having a good time. And this is really interesting because a lot of the discourses around these kinds of games at this time were such that people thought that they were distracting people, actually disconnecting them. There was a lot of stories of people walking off cliffs because they weren't paying attention. What we found through our research was that actually they were really paying attention to their surroundings, minus the occasional silly person that was Pokemon going and driving. So this is just one example with mobile games. But actually, I feel like this is the case with a lot of mobile technology and immersive technology, that they're actually helping us to foster better, stronger relationships. I just did a study of using virtual reality headsets to have dates with a relational partner. And one of the things I found was that people were playing games, they were having conversations, they were actually building their relationships in this VR headset instead of using them to disconnect. And again, this is what the discourse says: is you go into this VR headset, you're not paying attention to your surroundings. But in actuality, people are doing all of these meaningful social activities in these digital virtual spaces.
So I know that sometimes you're at a dinner or something and you see people on their phone, you're like, wait a second, this is a problem. So it feels like we're talking about two separate things here, right? Because it seems like that we're deepening the relationships with the people who are online. Does it hurt the relationships of those who might be in the closer vicinity, or does it help them?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I always tell my students is we shouldn't go too far into binaries. We shouldn't say technologies are good or bad, harmful or not harmful, productive or unproductive. It's all about the way that we use them. And so by saying this, I don't want to suggest that things like phubbing, the idea where you're on your phone and not actually engaged with someone else on a date or when you're having dinner with family, isn't something that actually happens. But for so long in the sort of scholarly literature and for so long in popular culture, we've talked about devices like phones as disconnecting us, as making us isolated. There's a famous psychologist named Sherry Turkle. She has this whole spiel and a TED Talk and a book that says we're alone together, that we're together with each other, but because of our devices, we're actually continuously isolated from the people that we care about most. And so my research which is often informed by my advisor, Dr. De Souza y Silva, who really started this conversation, is to suggest that that's not the whole story, that there are really meaningful connections that happen. But of course, you have to always keep your eye to the other. I also just really want to emphasize something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is that you see people going on screen fast, where they are trying to monitor how much time they're spending on their screen. Or there's a sort of culture where we consider too much screen time as being inherently bad. And I want to emphasize that there are meaningful activities happening on our devices. We're seeking out news and information. We're checking our email and engaging at work. We are coordinating activities with friends. We are coordinating our own lives and our calendar. And we're showing support and showing up for people, So I think that there's a bad thing that happens when we don't think critically about the ways that we're engaging with our devices.
Can you speak to the loneliness epidemic and how our screens might actually be helpful in fighting loneliness and building these meaningful connections?
The loneliness epidemic is, of course, I think it was increased by the global COVID-19 pandemic, where many of us were physically isolated from one another, and our devices were, in many cases, our only ties to the social world. So at the same time that we see people feeling super isolated, these devices that we've continuously demonized as being bad and harmful and disconnected kept us connected, right? I remember at that time, I had some family and friends that lived overseas, and we'd hop on this app called Marco Polo, and we just talk throughout the day. And sometimes we'd do karaoke where we'd sing a part of a song, which is really cringe. I recognize it. I love karaoke. And we'd send it back and forth to one another. And it was just a way of being co-present with others, even in this time of great isolation. But even today, we see this with high rates of depression and anxiety in young adolescents, and college students. And a lot of the times what we see is that they're turning to their phones to form that sense of connectivity. Because what happens is when you're in online spaces, you have a world of people at disposal with similar interests to you, who can relate to similar things that you're going through. And things like algorithms help us to find those people and to connect with them, because it's really good at figuring out who we are, what our interests are. But I do think there is value to face-to-face connections. Otherwise, we would all be at home and never actually go anywhere to meet up with anyone. And there was, in the early days of cyberculture, there was this idea that because of the internet, suddenly we'd never have to leave our homes. We would all telecommute to work. We wouldn't actually meet up with friends. We would just simply stay at home on our computers, and that's how we would socialize. But that never happened. That's kind of like a myth of techno-utopianism, because people need that sense of connection and belonging. And sometimes I think that even though we can get it through our devices, there are some limitations to being able to reach out and give a hug. Or if you're like me, you don't like touching and giving hugs, so you give a high five.
Have there been studies done to say, oh, there should be this much face-to-face contact versus this much online contact for a healthy human? Is there research suggesting that this whole metaverse that may or may not come to fruition as fast as we think it might is actually helpful rather than harmful?
For someone like me who kind of is introverted and a little socially awkward, that percentage would probably be like 20% threshold of spending time with others in face-to-face, and then 80 isolated at my home with my dog. But I do think that there are two kinds of research that are happening right now. The one is a sort of research that says, how can we count how harmful spending all of this time on our devices are? And this is often trying to figure out what are the social woes that emerge as we're constantly connected to devices versus one another and face to face. And then there's another thread of research that is looking at what actually emerges as we're spending time on our devices. But I just want to emphasize that I think that a problem of this is this distinction between being online and offline, as if they're two separate things. Whereas today, we can be on our phones and online no matter where we are. It's not like you have to go to a distinct space and now you're suddenly online. Instead, we're always online. We're always connected to other people, even when we're in these face-to-face conversations. So I think there's maybe even a flaw in thinking that one is better than the other, because we're always constantly doing both. You might prioritize or privilege one in a particular moment, but in general, I think that these things are interwoven. And people, I think, are getting maybe more skillful at or maybe not skillful, people are being required to develop social norms around what it means to be online and to be in person at the same time. And so this is a moment of deep stabilization where we're living in these spaces where the digital and the physical world are kind of blurred. And we have to figure out as a society, within our community, what's this acceptable practice? Is it okay in my classroom for my students to pull out their phone and text their mom that they're doing okay and they're also doing all their homework? Some professors are like, absolutely not. You're not paying attention. Other professors might have a more generous perspective and say, like, because these devices are so pervasive, it's silly to say that, of course, these things are kind of blurred together, work, life, public, private, that sort of thing.
Blurred. As we get more faces, phones, right, with the Vision Pro, as we get more headsets that actually are lighter, they go longer, they will allow us to do things we couldn't do previously. Do you foresee, based on the research that we have now, any changes in the workplace specifically? Because I can imagine connecting with coworkers on Zoom might look different whenever you have a phone strapped to your face and your eyes are actually being, teleported to another space.
Well, in some industries, these kinds of devices, these augmented reality devices have already been implemented. For example, in the medical profession, they've been used to aid in surgery. In factories, the ability to augment the environment by overlaying digital information onto the physical environment is helping to reduce safety concerns, is helping people to work more efficiently. But I don't know about the sort of actual social aspects of the job. A couple of, well, maybe it wasn't a couple, maybe it was a long time ago at this point. Do you remember the Google glasses? The Google glasses?
I will admit that I owned Google Glass. I was pumped about it. I was like, yes, a new technology. I want to be on the frontier. I want to experience this. And I was a little let down, to be honest, inexperienced.
I actually use these, but I've read about them and that people really felt uncomfortable with the Google Glass. For one, because they had a recording device embedded in this. And so people felt really uncomfortable with the surveillance aspect. And so I think there's also a concern that will emerge as we try to integrate more and more of these devices into the workplace about people's right to privacy. I think the other thing that we need to think about with these kinds of devices that add information while we're engaging in these social encounters is the extent to which it's actually adding something productive, and it's not just a novelty that disrupts the workplace environment. And so we might ask, like, what can it actually productively do? In the case of the medical field, we can find that, it's actually helping to guide surgery. This information that's occurring in real time is actually providing something meaningful. But what will it actually add to the social interaction? Let's say we're sitting around a conference room table. Is it the ability to quickly pull up reports on whatever augmented reality or mixed reality device that you're holding and to see them without other people seeing them? Or you might think of like, okay, I remember there's a video that Meta, used to be Facebook, released for their sort of Meta Quest devices. It's a virtual reality headset where you and your avatar could sit around a conference table and hold a meeting. And it would be just like hanging out around a conference table in real life. But right now, I don't think the technology is quite there because you don't really have gesture responses. So you can't really see with the avatar that someone's smiling or frowning or whatever, And so there are limitations, and there's not the ability to actually to interact in the same space in the same way. But I always say it's not necessarily a good thing to say, oh, we don't have to worry about that because the technology is not yet there. The technology will almost always get there. The question that I'm more interested in is how can we shape the technology to maintain our values, ethical concerns, or to respond to ethical concerns and so forth. And so how can we do it in a way that keeps people's data privacy? How can we do it in a way that mitigates their data privacy concerns, I should say? How can we do it in a way that adds meaning to the interaction or adds value to the interaction versus, adding a distraction or adding yet another thing we have to layer on to our workday? These are questions and concerns that we have to negotiate because I do think that eventually we're going to get there. But the question is, what will it look like when we do?
And what will the infrastructure look like? Because I know you've studied infrastructure and how that might impact our lives, our digital lives, and our digital culture.
Yeah, So my study of infrastructure, specifically infrastructures of communication, I'm looking at how do these things impact the user experience. So a lot of the times we forget the infrastructure. They're ugly, they're boring. No one cares about the cell phone tower unless it's in their backyard. No one really pays attention to the cables that are being buried under the street unless it's digging up their front yard to be laid. But these infrastructures are so incredibly important to creating these immersive environments or to create even better technologies that respond in real time to our particular need. So, for example, I studied edge computing, which is a new infrastructure. And because of edge computing, which by the way, I should explain what it is first. It's kind of like the cloud, but it's like bringing the cloud infrastructure closer to everyday people so that the internet is faster. And because of that, you have things like better gaming because there's not visual lag in video games. You have better VR experiences for the same reason. There's not going to be that visual lag that creates motion or cyber sickness for users. You can also have more data intensive programs running, and then information runs faster and in real time when the infrastructure is closer to the device. So an important use case of this is what we call assisted cognition devices. They're essentially augmented reality or mixed reality headset that people can wear that will help them to perform everyday tasks, specifically when they have cognitive disability. So someone might be trying to assemble a sandwich, and because the information is occurring in real time and is able to analyze the physical environment in real time, that person is then able to assemble the sandwich step by step, getting little commands whispered in their ear. And this is a project coming out of the Living Edge Lab I think at Carnegie Mellon University. But it's just an example of like how these digital and physical worlds increasingly blur, and how my research contributes is say this is all an infrastructural feat. It is a coordination of the movement of data across time and space that allow these worlds to blur more and more together.
I am hearing amazing things that I want to experience now, but they're not here yet. But with the help of AI, I imagine we might have it sooner than we might think. What is the intersection between AI and this edge computing you're talking about?
Well, one of the intersections is mobility. So when you think about moving around the world connected to a network connection, whether that's the internet or a local network, one of the things that AI can help do is to guide your movement. And increasingly, we see that AI is able to move vehicles, drones, ships, all on its own by being able to process data in real time. So this is like one of the examples. Another example is just what I was just talking about. The assisted cognition relies on AI to tell people, like to analyze the physical environment and say, this is what you need to do in this very next situation. So a lot of people just think about AI in terms of like ChatGPT or DALL-E, the generative AI, where you're creating output. The AI is increasingly a decision-making but decision-making system that, guides what we do, how we do it. It also gatekeeps. It can determine whether or not someone can do something in reality. So for example, in some other countries, AI was used during the COVID-19 pandemic to quickly determine whether or not someone was potentially at risk of transmitting COVID. So AI would quickly make a decision about whether someone was allowed into a business or to a particular venue. And interestingly, like that took the burden off of human actors to be like, no, you can't come in, you're a potential risk. But then, of course, you have concerns when you have AI making decisions that impact on people, where we know that there are biases in these systems. And what happens when AI has the capacity to deny someone entry into a specific space? What happens when AI is charged with making decisions about how we move through the world? An interesting problem that arises is it's called sort of like it's a moral experiment where an autonomous vehicle that's being guided by AI has to make a decision about whether to hit a grandmother or whether to hit a child. And this is like a thing that could potentially happen. And the answer to that is based on what culture you're embedded in. If you're embedded in a culture that values its elderly population, then you're going to hit the child. If you're in a culture that values its children and says, the children have all the potential, then you're going to hit the grandmother. And just to explain why you would hit the child instead of the grandmother is in a culture that values its elderly, it says, oh, the child hasn't contributed anything to society. The grandmother has a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and lifetime experiences that is valuable to us. And so what I'm trying to get to here with this really tragic example, a very dark example, is that as AI becomes further integrated into our everyday life, we have to be very critical about what we do to guide its development, what kinds of moral values we assign to it, and whose moral values get embedded within this algorithm, or series of algorithms, I should say, that make these decisions.
I'm glad that you went dark, because before, all I was hearing was a rosy picture of the future and this mobile computing and AR and VR just helping us and AI helping us, because I imagine that there are other examples where AI might be able to help us with intercultural communication. Have you had a chance to look at any of those kinds of examples beyond the trolley problem you just shared?
Yeah, it is actually the trolley problem, isn't it? I've not actually that I can think of thought of AI in an intercultural context, but I can imagine it would be really great for translating across contexts. For instance, I remember I was in Paris a couple of years ago attending the International Communication Association conference, and I don't speak French. And so a lot of the ways that I got around was by, bringing out my phone, typing something and translating it, and then having the next person type back to me. So I think in that sense, it could just function as a translation tool by automatically picking up on what's being said and translating it in real time. But more importantly, I would say, as we think about AI in these sort of cross-cultural contexts, I would say, how do we embed it in culture differentially? Because a lot of the times when we think about technologies, we think of like single solution. And the more interesting thing would be creating multiple solutions that can be localized to a particular context and uphold the laws, the values, and other things of that nature.
I know a lot of our students are studying public relations, they're studying campaigns, they're figuring out how to speak to audiences that they've done research on. How might this kind of research, both in edge computing and artificial intelligence, impact the lives of those professionals?
So I think that one of the major things that we can prepare our students with is the ability to create with AI. I know right now there's like a big upheaval in academia, even in corporate culture as well. We're thinking about like banning AI, like, oh, you're not allowed to write with AI or whatever. But I think that there's actually a lot of productive potential in what it means to think with AI. To not ban it, but to say, what does it mean to use its insights and then to build around that? One, it can be a creative process. I can't tell you the number of times that I've popped into ChatGPT and just plopped some ideas and said, can you add on to what I'm thinking? And that can help generate ideas. In terms of like creative content, like programs like Dolly, of course, they pose like questions about like copyright and, creative remediation of media, but they also have the potential for students in PR and students that are going into being communication professionals to help them to create, to quickly turn out information. And I think there's a potential that when we have something like ChatGPT or whatever equivalencies come out in the future, focusing on, getting the ideas out there, students can then turn their focus, I should say professionals can then turn their focus to making sure information is accurate, that they can turn their focus then to making sure that it's delivered in a meaningful way. So it frees up our time in some way. And then, of course, again, I've already said this once, but there's going to have to be some like norming that happens, right? It's a new technology. So of course, there are going to be misuses. Of course, there are going to be really cool things that emerge from it. But eventually, it will become stabilized as a part of what I call the socio-technical field, the relationship between social and technical or technological, where we as a society figure out how it becomes integrated. It's not a question. AI technology will become a part of our workforce. In many ways, they already are. It's about shaping how they become that. And I think that we're doing a disservice to students by saying you can't use it. It's better to say use it, but let's learn how to use it ethically. Let's use it creatively. Let's use it to be better professionals, to think faster, to do faster, to grab those spelling errors. And I want to flag something really quickly. Many people are like, oh, AI is so new. AI has been around for a long time. In fact, something as simple as spell checker is a kind of AI. And I've seen on the internet that some students have had their papers flagged for AI when actually they've just been using the Grammarly spell checker. And I'm like, well, Grammarly and spell checkers in general, the one that's in Microsoft Word, is itself a form of AI. The only difference is that we now accept it as standard practice that you use the Microsoft Word spell checker. But I'm sure if we go back to the past, there was this moment in time where people were like, no, you have to know how to spell words because you're not always going to have a Microsoft spell checker available to you. So we don't want to be Luddites, right? We want to be accepting of change, but then critical about how we integrate it.
And how we maintain the critical thinking skills. Because I am one of the most liberal, let's apply AI in all of our classes. Let's get it in there. Let's break it. Let's see what it does good. Let's see what it does bad. Let's analyze it. Let's think critically about it. But at the same time, I also see where, wait a second, if we're going to AI first, that can really help degrade the way that we communicate in significant ways, right? So using it as a tool and making sure that you're teaching students how to use it. Have you had a chance to figure out ways to make it work for you in ways that maybe professionally or academically have helped you?
Yeah, so I want to flag something you said before we get to professionally academically, which is that I think that it is possible to think critically with AI. I think it pushes us to think even more critically. And I think that a challenge for educators right now is to design assignments that don't just ask for spitting out rote facts, because all AI is doing is pulling information from the internet that was already there. So how can we design better assignments that ask students to engage in that critical thinking and to move beyond the facts and to actually engage analysis? Now, how have I integrated it into my everyday life and my work as a professional? One of the things that I've done is like when I'm doing research, and I was recently writing a grant on disasters and disaster recovery using mobile technology. I was not as familiar with the disaster literature because I'm a mobile communication researcher. So I asked ChatGPT, who are the lead scholars in disaster research? And that helped me get started with my literature search and my literature review. I've used it for proofreading and also plopped some things that I've written in there and said, okay, can you give me some feedback on what points I'm missing? And so it'll say, yes, you have a great analysis, but have you considered this other perspective? Actually, no, I haven't. And so, I used to work in a sort of cubicle setting where it became really easy to pop over to a friend and say, hey, can you read this? But I don't always have that luxury. Today, I'm usually at home again with my dog hanging out. So ChatGPT, in many ways, for me, is like a friend that I can ask for feedback. Now, I don't take what it writes for me and use that as my own because that would be unethical. I would have to cite ChatGPT's output if I did that. But I don't see anything wrong with, say, ChatGPT, can you analyze my writing and figure out if there are places that I can make better points or where I can articulate this a little bit more clearly? I think it's really great for doing that. I also use it as a travel planner, which is silly. This is like a frivolous example, but it's like a fun thing. I needed to drive from North Carolina to San Antonio, and I was like, can you plan regular stops along the highway for fuel that's affordable and that will allow my dog to get a walk? And ChatGPT planned the whole trip, including hotels for me. And so that saved me a bunch of time that otherwise I would have spent like zooming around the Google map looking for midpoints along the way.
Those are excellent use cases for this new technology. I'm teaching an AI and personal branding course, and I'm imagining you would have advice for our students in the realm of social media specifically, and how we can apply artificial intelligence, edge computing knowledge to this idea of improving our social media presence so that we can get a job or help to attract clients or advance our goals in a social cause or an employment cause. Can you speak a little bit to the intersection between social media and AI and edge computing?
Well, I think it's really important to develop a personal brand and to have an active social presence. I know I meet a lot of people. They're like, oh, I'm not on social media. And I'm like, are you sure, first of all? Because like even LinkedIn is social media. It's just not what we think of as like the fun, entertainment oriented. But, if we're trying to grow as professionals, it's important to showcase our work and to put ourselves out there. But there's also a competing pressure of how do you actually do that while also maintaining having a social life, meeting all of your professional goals. And it can even be frowned upon as a professional to be on social networking site, even if you're promoting your work. But some people might think like, oh, this person's always out there posting. What are they actually doing their job? And so I can imagine that AI might help with creating content for your personal brand, and at the very least, cleaning up content that you might want put out there, especially with at the end of a tired day, your brain is just not at its best performance. And you're just like, please just someone review this before I post it publicly to the web. But one other thing that I was thinking about when you asked that question is the emergence of AI generated photos or edited photos, which I've seen many people do where, they just take an ordinary photo of themselves and they put it into an AI software and it creates a professional portrait. It's like, a coat over them, cleans up their face, no wrinkle. And I don't know how I feel about that. On the one hand, I don't know that there's any such thing as true authenticity in online spaces. I think all versions of our online selves are a version of us. They are a version of who we are. There's no space in the world, online or offline, where you're getting that of Regan. It's all versions of me that I put on carefully for you all to like. But on the other hand, I wonder about the extent to which AI portraits can mislead people. And I'm getting into the concept of catfishing, right? And it's not that employers should care how you look, but I have seen certain AI portraits of people that just look so drastically different from who they are that I would not recognize them in a real encounter. Because it reverses any signs of how old they are and so forth. And so I think that if we're using these features that are available to us to craft a professional brand, we should be careful about the extent to which we're actually representing who we are as a person, as a professional, and so forth, because we want to be recognized. We want to be authentic with this sort of like quotation marks around this word to who we actually are. And sometimes I worry with AI that we can lose some of that sense of authenticity because you are getting output from something that is building from its knowledge of everyone and everyone's content. So it could be like almost creating homogenization of content and losing that personal flavor.
I can imagine that there's some research about homogenization and how it might impact online cultures. Because I know that whenever you're studying these online cultures and social media cultures, it's different based on platform. It's different based on the mechanics of even the device for the VR or the AR. Have you noticed some differences there in online cultures?
Well, there's actually been a lot of conversations in the field of cultural study about how online environments and globalization through online environments create like homogeneity amongst cultures, where, suddenly you're finding a McDonald's in places where you otherwise would. Or the more recent one on TikTok that I've seen is that you go to a cafe in Paris and it looks like you could be in a cafe in New York City. And because of like this sort of like awareness, because of internet technology, what's happening in other spaces, what's trendy in other spaces, we end up like creating like a more homogenous culture where everyone's trying to be trendy across the globe, and you start to lose the sort of essence of a space. And so I can imagine again with AI that this could happen where because AI is pulling from so much content across the internet, the output that it generates is going to be similarly homogeneous. And like let's talk about this a little bit more. So when we're looking at photos, for example, AI has a set of protocols for how it edits photos. It might clean up any blemishes. It might remove wrinkles. It might, remove the frizz, the grays in my hair that have emerged in recent years. And while we might say, oh, that's awesome, that's really, really good, there are also like aesthetic values embedded in those choices that say what you should look like and what it means to be presentable or professional, and in some cases, beautiful. And that can be really harmful to people. It can be harmful to their self-image. It can erase the authenticity of who they are. Like, for instance, I have a beauty mark here, and a lot of the times these AI photo generators, they remove that, even though I love that feature of me. And so there's even more harmful ones where we see people of color, their skin being whitewashed because the AI assumes that that's a aesthetic value to be white. And we know that to be a harmful discourse and a harmful standard to encode into the AI and into algorithm. And so again, going dark, like there can be some true harm that happens as we aim for homogeneity, because when we are becoming homogeneous as a society, we are saying that there is a singular thing that is valued. And that worries me quite a bit.
As you explore these new technologies, the AR, the VR, the edge computing, what are some of the cultural implications of using these technologies? And what should we maybe be on the lookout for both at work and in our personal lives?
Well, one of the things that I think about, especially at VR environments, is that when we're in these environments, we have to elect an avatar that acts on our behalf. So one thing that's really important in the world of avatars, and this has been the case since the very beginning of virtual worlds and online environments. So think about early moods, these text-based environments where you had to describe yourself, is the ability to give people the opportunity to describe themselves in a way that is meaningful to them versus enforcing certain things. And we saw this also with like emojis in early days, right? Where the sort of default was white. So we want the ability to express ourselves in these immersive environments and to get as close, I think, many times to if we're expecting these to replicate face-to-face interactions, to get closer to that. So having closer what we call social fidelity, where the sort of interface actually replicates the things that we expect in face-to-face interaction, being able to read nonverbal expressions like smiling or frowning or whatever it is, the ability to interact. And that currently we have that to some extent. I have gone on dates in my virtual reality headset with my partner, and we play mini golf, and I like stand in front of his view of the hole so that he can't shoot the ball. I'm being a menace. I'm purposefully being a menace. But that's a really cool opportunity to sort of like interact in space. So I think that's going to be important to the workforce. It's creating a shared space in which people can represent themselves in a meaningful way. Another thing that I think that we need to think about is, especially as the realities start to blur together, the physical reality with the digital reality. So moving away from VR to more mixed reality or augmented reality is the overlays of information onto our everyday environments. So I'm going to go back to the Pokemon Go example for a minute. I love Pokemon Go. I don't play actively anymore, but I like to talk about it because I think it's such an interesting example. In these mixed reality environments where digital information is overlaid, it's going to be important to see what information gets prioritized and whose information gets prioritized. So the Pokemon Go example, when you go to a Pokestop in the game, it highlights information about specific spaces. So places like churches, historical monuments were the first sort of places that were highlighted in the game. And you could look and see a little bit more information about that particular space. Again, this is a playful environment, so we don't take that very seriously. But when we think about the sort of increasing significance of mixed and augmented reality environments, or even just the ability to quickly look something up about a place, the question of who gets to write that information, what details are important, whose history gets represented when we're referencing a specific landmark or historical mark or something of that nature, are all important cultural questions about what gets said about space and place and whose narratives get told. And so I hope that answers the question to some extent. It's a messy world we live in because we have so much information available, and there are important decisions to make about what information gets prioritized. AI can help us make some of those decisions. And I think increasingly, though, we're going to need to think about localization, how to adapt content to specific cultures. So information gets prioritized based on where you are. And then increasingly, I think AI can help as well with customizing content to you. So making sure that the digital information you receive or that is overlaid onto your environment reflects your interests, your needs, your value. Now, of course, with that, we get into echo chambers and a sort of other issue with, just confirmation bias where the same information gets relayed back to you over and over. But it is something to think about how we can honor difference and individuality and specific culture in this environment where AI can be calling the shot.
I'm imagining a historical landmark or a historical institution and it being written about or presented a very different way based on what AI knows about us. I know based on the futurists and where things are going and the predictions that AI agents are right around the corner. We're going to have a much better Siri, a much better Alexa, much better AI assistants very soon. What do you see the role of these everyday assistants like Alexa or Siri or other AI that are becoming more embedded in our lives?
Well, I got my parents a Siri a couple of years ago, and I don't think they know this. This is actually a secret. I set it up for them with my email, and I could see everything that they asked it, which They were telling the Siri to say mean things to each other. And they were asking it to tell them bad jokes and so forth. And so I don't think they ever actually used it aside from playing a song for any sort of productive purpose. It provided a sense of entertainment value. So I think that that's one role that it can play is we don't always have to think of like productive professional purpose of these things. Sometimes they can provide light and levity in these otherwise dark times that we live in. But I think there's also a potential, which is what I intended when I bought them this, to help with bridging digital divides. Specifically in low literacy populations where reading and writing is not possible. Now, my parents can read and write. I don't want to imply that they can't, but also in low technological literacy devices because it's a natural user interface where you can speak commands to it and it responds with information. And so, in many cases, these types of personal assistant devices have been actually quite critical to bringing a new generation of people onto the internet that weren't before. Now, there's a couple of concerns with that. One, my mom has a Southern accent. And so early days, it wasn't able to understand her. And she'd say, I have to put on my city voice to get her to understand. She goes, Siri, to get Siri to actually respond to her. Now, I assume that as the technology advances, that it will be better at adapting to specific accents or dialects and so forth. The other thing is that Siri, Alexa, Cortana, all of these devices operate within what we call sort of closed ecosystem, where they provide a certain version of the internet. It's not the internet that happens when I go on Google and search information where I can just browse from site to site. Instead, they have very specific kinds of interactions that you can do. You can search key phrases, and they have limitations. I've had many times Siri or Alexa say, I can't answer that. And so we have to question then these sort of platforms and their overlords, Amazon, Google, what content they allow us to have access to. And so there's like a restriction of access to information when we're using these as our only way of accessing the internet. Again, as has been the narrative of this entire conversation, there's good and there's bad.
Do you see any other harms coming from this? You see some things we should be looking out for in terms of how it might shape our culture or shape our lives in ways that we need to be prepared for now?
Well, there's always the question of privacy. And we already know that our devices are listening to us. And this is not like a conspiracy. We purposefully and in practice enact or enable for our devices to have access to our microphone, to have access to our camera. And so if I'm talking about dog toys and how my dog always definitely needs more toys, I can guarantee that if I go on Instagram, who I've given certain permissions to, that I'm going to see an ad for Chewy or some equivalency like PetSmart. In addition, like we know that on many of our devices, if you have Siri enabled or if you have Google Cortana enabled, that they're constantly listening to your conversation for what they call watchwords so that they can provide more helpful search results. Now, there's a question there. One, it's going to be helpful because it's listening, it's scanning the content of my communications for things that it can do to optimize and improve my life. So, for example, if I receive an email, this is not just orally, it's also the case through like the conversations I'm having via text message and so forth. If I receive an email from you and you say, Ragan, let's have a conversation on Thursday at this time, it's going to automatically prompt me on my calendar to schedule that event so I don't forget it. So that's good. But the bad thing is that that's an invasion of privacy to some extent, that this major corporation like Apple has access to my personal, intimate conversations, the things that I'm doing in my daily life. A lot of people like to frame it as a trade-off. I'm trading off my privacy, my data privacy, for the conveniences that the technology offers. I think that is a fallacy, and it's not just my thought. There are many scholars who also claim it is a fallacy as well. And the reason that we say that is because we can still have the conveniences of technology without our data being sold to third parties and without, these corporations being able to mine our data to, sell us more products. We can still have these optimizations, and we should be able, as consumers and users of technology, have more control over our data and what happens with it. And this is not just a problem for these virtual assistants. This is a problem for many things, including the VR headsets that we were talking about earlier, and mixed reality. Also with mobile phones, everywhere you go, there are tracking technology. And we often don't even realize how pervasive they are within our society. For example, just as a point, I bought something at Walmart. and it was a bag of dog food for Achilles, my pup. And I got an email a couple of days later that was like, can you rate your Rachel Ray dog food? And I was like, how did it know that I purchased it? And the reason is because I, at one point, created a Walmart account with the Walmart Plus or something of that nature. And I'd register my card to it so that I could get a delivery during the pandemic. And it linked my debit card to that account. And so it knew when I scanned my debit card that I had made that purchase. And that's the only way, because the app wasn't even on my phone anymore. So what I had to do was go in, because there was no privacy setting that I could do to avoid that. I had to delete my account from Walmart. But even still, now they know who I am and they know what I'm doing. They just can't email me about it. And so even something as simple as a credit card, which we don't think as being like an internet connected technology, has tracking capabilities. We live in what Mark Andrejevic, he's a scholar of surveillance, he calls it a surveillance society, where we are just continuously under. And again, I'm not conspiratorial. I'm probably the least conspiratorial person that you've met, but I do care a lot about data privacy in online environments and user and consumer rights to have their data protected.
Well, I've heard it described as surveillance capitalism, right? This idea of the pervasive, you don't have a privacy button. You can't hit private on those VR glasses. You can't hit private like you can on some devices. But even when you hit private, maybe it's not private, maybe it's not completely trustworthy. Do you have any advice for people who want to protect themselves, especially as we interact in places we have to? For example, I feel like LinkedIn is not optional. I have to have a LinkedIn profile and I have to interact with colleagues as a part of my job in teaching communication. So how can students or professionals guard themselves against these kinds of surveillance capitalism that is going to get worse with more efficient technologies like edge computing and VR, AR, and AI?
Yeah. So in some ways, I think it's a difficult, if not impossible, task to fully, protect yourself. Even if you go so far as to toss your computer into the dumpster, Ron Swanson style from Parks and Recreation, you're still going to be under surveillance because there are cameras out in the world that are tracking, traffic down highways and so forth. So like, one, you're not going to get away from it. But what you can do is you can be a more conscious user of sites and networks and so forth. And by that, I mean actually reading those terms of services of privacy policy and actually looking at the privacy setting enabled on your phone and actually thinking about who and when you're sharing information and deciding when information should be shared to a particular audience. And I think that we sometimes do this, but a lot of the times it does a lot of extra effort. For instance, even when I go on sites and it's like, oh, would you like to enable cookies or look at the setting? It is a lot of extra work when I'm just trying to find quick information to say reject all but necessary cookies. It is an extra step. And I think in many ways, designers of these kind of internet technologies make it so because it is profitable for them to have access to our data. And so I would urge people that are going into the technology sector, whether that's our students that are communication professionals that are going to go to be designers, or we're looking at engineers, computer scientists, software developers, to actually design socially responsible technologies that allow people choice and that makes it easier. And then relatedly to the technical writers that are doing these privacy policies and terms of service, make the information easily understood. There's so much legalese in terms of service and privacy policy. And then a lot of the times what I see by reading these things is that sometimes they do a haphazard job of constructing them. I recently was reading the privacy policy for a health tracking app, and there was a whole section that had lorem ipsum dummy text just embedded in it. And it was just very clear that they did not finish the work. And that's terrible, right? Because how am I supposed to know my rights as a user of this thing if there's no information there? And so we have to be conscious consumers of information and conscious users. But I always am hesitant to put the burden on the individual. And I instead say I put this burden on tech corporations, platforms, and so forth to be responsible, to design responsible technologies, and to lower the threshold for people understanding and enacting settings that work for them and that they feel comfortable with.
I think that is such an important issue, and I appreciate your clarity on how we can urge our Congress people, our tech providers, and our colleagues to watch out for the common good, which sometimes is neglected. You had mentioned earlier crisis communication and how crisis communication might be impacted by these kinds of technologies that you've studied. Can you speak a little bit to how crisis communication intersects with these kinds of technologies?
So I'm glad you kind of asked because this gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I'm working on currently. So for the past couple of years, I've been looking at how mobile technology specifically and mobile safety apps can help people to feel safe when they're moving about the world. I've also been really critical of these kinds of apps because of things like location sharing, where your data becomes, available to these corporations, or you might share your location with an intimate partner and then your relationship goes sour and they might, use that information harmfully. More recently, my research has turned to say, how can we study the role of mobile technologies and digital technologies more broadly in disaster contexts? So I'm shifting from safety to actually like self-preservation and, response and recovery effort. And what's interesting is we know these technologies can be helpful, but even if you go to like some of the Red Cross websites, they say that there's just in these urgent circumstances, there's not enough time to be innovative and there's not enough training about how to use them for response recovery in specific communities. So I'm trying to do that work currently. And I'm wanting to look at communities and say, like, what are you doing? How are you using your mobile phone? Or how are you when infrastructures have been depleted, like because cell phone towers, if a hurricane or tornado go down, how are you setting up your own like mesh network of infrastructure to be connected, to share resources, to provide social support, to coordinate how to get out and to find new housing or to seek higher ground, so to speak, both metaphorically and quite literally. And, there's a lot of opportunity, not just among the people that have been impacted or affected by disasters, but also for the people that are engaging in rescue operation. There have been a couple of important use cases. One with edge computing, where in cases where the infrastructures have been depleted, they're able to attach these sort of edge infrastructures to drones and fly these drones over a space and deliver a sort of network of coverage temporarily so that the disaster response recovery team can continue their operation. Or there's examples of in like dense fires, like wildfires, being able to fly drones into that area to see the conditions of the wildfire so that first responders or people that are attempting to fight those fires don't have to risk their lives to go into those spaces. And so a lot of times we're like always really worried about technologies like AI and other robotic technologies taking our place. In some cases, I think there's a value to it being able to move into the world and through the world in our absence. Of course, there are harms. There's always harm. Don't want to, especially when we're thinking about war contexts and so forth, when these things are fought through computers versus or robots versus people on the ground. But without getting into that super dark context, in terms of crisis response, recovery, there is a lot of potential, but we need more research on what that potential is, how to implement it, what technologies are needed, and how to do that in a way that helps the community recover more quickly and doesn't create additional issues within a particular community as well.
I'm wondering how we can apply this to the personal level, because if edge computing, if AI, if these technologies are making it more and more difficult to be private and even in your own space, where are we going to go with that, right? Like it just seemed like a crazy connection because the technologies are getting so good at the same time that privacy is being written out of our culture, right?
Yeah, well, there's a sort of like belief that public and private are completely blurred at this point because this device right here connects us to a world outside, to a public at all times. So I can be like, in my bed, the one of the most private, intimate places in my home and connected to a wide public. And we in many ways enact this where we take photos and share in our most private spaces. We share our most private moments. There's even if a sort of technology can determine our physical location in space by sort of a trilateration of Wi-Fi signals or something else, like uh, that, I don't think that even if that weren't the case, that we'd have any sense of privacy. Let me rephrase that a little bit better. I don't think that even if we took away one thing, that we'd still have any sense of privacy in our home. Right now, I'm wearing can't really see a busted GPS smartwatch. And I tell my students when I teach about mobile technologies, I'm like, we wear these fitness trackers that know, and they're with us at all times, and they know our most intimate details. They can know when you're doing your most intimate activities because they are tracking all things about you, your location in space, your heart rate. This thing can track how often I breathe, what my sleep schedule is like. And so when you start combining pieces of data within their isolation, each piece of data seems relatively innocent. When you're looking at heart rate and physical location and whether or not you're breathing at a rapid rate, you can suddenly start discerning a lot about what a person's doing and where they're engaging in certain activities as well. And if you're combining this with other people's, let's say that you have access to other people's data, you can start painting pictures of who they're spending time with. And you start to get a whole picture of not only who a person is, what their physiological state is, but their social lives as well. And then if we're pulling it even further out, like if we're combining it with other bits of data that they're posting to Instagram and LinkedIn, you have an entire portrait of a person's life. And this is not something new. There was a leak of AOL, American Online, the old internet search results. And they were anonymized, but they were in order based on user and IP address. And there were people that were identified just by the basic questions that they had posted into the AOL search query. Things like how to find man in Gainesville, Florida, over 60, dog peeing inside, where to play bingo. And so you start putting these like little pieces together. Okay, someone that's looking for a man, they have a dog that has issues with peeing inside. They go play bingo at this particular area. When you start putting these things aside, it becomes very easy, even when information is anonymized, to identify a specific person. And so even by, removing who a person is from their data, it doesn't guarantee the privacy, not when that information becomes public.
And now an AI marketer could make an even better case to get me to buy that thing because they know exactly what moment to intercede into my feed, right? And it's like, why is this algorithm reading my mind again, right? I wanted to ask you about sources of information. Where do you go to learn about these new technologies? Where do you go to get insights about what will be so soon?
I think I do a lot of news reading. I spend a lot of time looking at articles from Wired. I also there's a group called, I think it's Data and Society, and they're academically oriented group that kind of act like watchdogs for the tech industry. And they're continuously reporting on newest technologies and the potential social harm. MIT Media Lab is another great source of critical articles about new technologies. And then just your typical sources like Slate will typically post here's the newest, the latest and greatest. But yeah, I poke around on the techie corners of the internet. I also really like listening to podcasts about technology and culture. There's one that used to be on. It was called Reply All. And that was a really fun one too, because they would dive into niche tech content. They stopped producing I think there was some issues with their team, but the podcasts are still there. So I would encourage people to go listen because they would just dive into the weirdest parts of the internet. And I love that.
Excellent. And those are great places to look for both weak signals and strong signals about what might be. And I want to give you an opportunity to tell us what might be. Do you have any predictions for how to prepare for these new technologies that are emerging so quickly?
It does often feel like technology is moving at such a rapid rate. And this is big technology, right? That it's hard to keep up with our technological literacies. That, one of the things that I say is just get in there and explore, but always be critical. I consider myself like a person that does critical studies of technology. So I always have a couple of questions in mind. How does this impact on users and who are the intended users? Because the design and the privacy policy and the terms of service, they can all tell you a lot about who a company believes or who a corporation believes are their intended users. And it can also tell you a lot about what they allow and don't allow. Next thing I'm always concerned about is who's excluded or whose values are not represented by a particular technology or system or platform. Next thing is just continuously keeping an eye to potential harms, because we know that technology, regardless of whether a designer intends it or not, can produce social harm. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize is I'm really interested in not just these big corporations' technological innovations, because if we're looking at everyday people in society, we see people innovate innovating on their own. And so this is something also, both in terms of where I look for sources and also, uh, how I keep up to date is I look at the fringes of society and how people are innovating with technologies and building networks and so forth to respond to what they perceive as being harmed by these larger technological corporations. So you might see an app that addresses the privacy concerns of a whole suite of other apps. Or you might see people creating a wireless mesh network when the internet infrastructures go down. And so to me, these moments where people are, doing it themselves and kind of challenging these major corporations are really exciting places to look. And I think that's where the real innovation is happening.
Have you seen any of those recently? Because wow, what a story of somebody engineering their way out of a problem and that engineering leading to a net benefit for all of us. Can you think of any other examples of that?
But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that in response to some of the legislation that overturned Roe v. Wade, there have been a group of women that have developed these covert, essentially safety networks where they're helping, the word is traffic, I guess, if you're looking from a government perspective, helping these women who need abortions to move across state boundaries or state border to get those. And this is happening through these technological networks that have been invented by women who are just frustrated with the change in legislation. I won't point to a specific place because they're sort of right to have these secret networks I would like to uphold or at least not expose. But that's just one example. But, there's this concept called tactical media, or even there's another term called creative, a network creativity, where we see people developing networks and technologies to respond to hardship. And so I would encourage you to look at something called the Mobile Network Creativity Repository and to contribute to it. And in this, you'll see examples of people building networks or using technologies creatively to respond to hardships. I created an entry during the pandemic that showed how people were taking school buses and turning them into Wi-Fi hotspots to respond to the hardship of not having internet access, especially in rural regions like where I grew up, where I think 1 in 5 people lack internet access. And also the same in San Antonio. I think when I moved here, it was 1 in 4 people lack internet access. So how are people navigating around that? How are they able to communicate despite these odds? How are they able to access resources? Those are really good moments where we see innovation happening, where we see people fighting against these larger corporations that control the price point for even accessing a service or control the terms by which you can use a service.
What actions do you recommend people take based on some of the things we've talked about in this conversation?
Oh, goodness. A fun, exciting question. So one, I would say, don't be afraid to challenge the online ecosystem and the technological ecosystem that you exist within. Increasingly, we see fields like user experience research emerge because these technological corporations are realizing that consumers and users have a voice and their voice matters because people will migrate away from a specific platform if it no longer suits their needs or if there are new terms and services that are not considered good for a particular user population. So don't be afraid to spend your user power in a productive way and don't just accept platform the way that they're presented to you. To be diligent. Constantly think about the sort of privacy practices. Think about what it means to work with AI or to allow AI to compose you as a professional or to compose your thoughts with you. And think about also people who are in lesser positions of power than you, people with less resources economically, socially, and how certain technologies might impact on them. Constantly have that in your mind when you decide to use a particular technology for a purpose, whether that's in the classroom, in a corporate space, in a social space. But in addition, stand up for those people to demand technologies that are accountable, that are socially responsible. And I know that feels like a kind of like a tall order because we are just individuals in relation to these companies that have so much amassed power. And I am very guilty of feeling that way. Like what I do doesn't make a difference. All I can be accountable for is myself. But if we don't make these small incremental changes, then there's going to be no governance over data collection, over any of it. So we have to use our collective voice to stand up for potential harms, to show what it means to exist in these online digital spaces in a meaningful, productive, socially responsible way.
And since you study gaming, you're giving us permission to play games with a critical mind and with these questions in the back of our mind, because the kind of gaming is a part of moving forward the internet culture or moving forward our own kinds of skills and activities online.
If I could say one thing, it is that games are meaningful parts of our culture, and not just in terms of giving us a break from the monotony of life. They are helping us to be aware of, they can help us to be aware of social issues. They can help us to be aware of our surroundings, especially when they're mobile games. They can actually transform our relationship to the world. And this can happen through narrative structures where the narrative itself teaches us important moral lessons or teaches us how to do something. This can happen by changing our relationship to others, by encouraging social connections through the gaming interface. And it can help us to connect with one another. That is the key point. So yes, games can be frivolous. They can be a thing that we do to turn off our brain to quote unquote escape reality. But there is a productive potential to use games for social good and for connectivity and for relationship building as well. And so, yes, play games, have fun, and think about community in doing so.
It's positive stress, something that we should seek out. And might it be another reason we should play games with one another, in addition to the meaningful relationships and connections you talk about?
I think potentially, if we're feeling social pressures to connect with one another and that actually engages us, then that could be a positive thing, like a positive stressor. When you're engaging in a competitive game of mini golf and you're worried about whether your partner is going to shoot the little putt ball into the hole, and there's that competitive aspect, right? Like that keeps us on the cutting edge. But I think I want to emphasize, as I have done already a couple of times, that yes, there can be like positive outcomes of games. We also have to be concerned about the negative aspects as well, that games can't have harmful discourses. They can have harmful narratives. And so we should be critical of the way they become integrated in our life, just like any other form of content, whether that's entertainment content or reading content and so forth. Think critically about what this is doing, what narratives it's supporting, and so forth.
Think critically. So many wonderful threads to pull on here. Dr. Glover, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about your research or connect with you?
Yes, I would recommend that anyone reach out to me on LinkedIn. I don't have a website currently. I got tired of maintaining it. Maybe AI will help me to get it back up and running. I still have my domain, but please reach out on LinkedIn. I'm happy to spark a conversation with anyone who's watched or listened and found any of my insights interesting, or if they want to offer a critique. I love having spirited debates about these sorts of things. So thank you so much for having me. This was a true delight, and I don't just say that, like, this was fun to talk about.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun too, obviously. And anytime we're talking about what's next, there's always predictions that are fun and predictions that might be terrifying. So I appreciate that you included a little bit of both in this conversation.
Yeah, and it's hard to do that because I love dystopias and I love the Black Mirror trajectory of everything is doom and gloom. So it's a real feat for me that I can be like, oh, positivity in this world of technology. So yeah, it's good to keep an eye towards it.
Awesome. And for our listeners, can you spell your name for how to reach out and what to search for?
Yes. So it's Ragan, Ragan, and last name is Glover, Glover. So if you want to reach me via email, it's ragan@utsa.edu or on LinkedIn.
Dr. Glover, thank you again.